Here is what we know. On February 1st, 2026, California enacted sweeping traffic enforcement reforms that fundamentally altered the legal landscape for drivers across the state. According to traffic safety implementation reports documented by the California Department of Motor Vehicles and corroborated by local law enforcement briefings, these changes represent the most significant overhaul of traffic law enforcement in over 2 decades. The new framework includes 10 major categories of violations, each carrying penalties ranging from several $100s to over $1,000 per incident. As reported by California Highway Patrol press releases and state legislative summaries, the enforcement structure now operates under what officials term a zero-tolerance compliance model. Key provisions documented in the official rollout include stricter hands-free device requirements that eliminate previous exceptions for stopped vehicles, expanded emergency lane protections with enhanced monitoring systems, and redefined safety zones that now encompass construction areas, bike lanes, pedestrian corridors, and hospital zones on a 24/7 basis. According to California's Office of Traffic Safety data cited in implementation documents, over 70% of citations under similar frameworks in pilot programs came from what officials classified as habitual violations rather than aggressive driving behavior. The state has positioned these measures as data-driven responses to traffic accident statistics and emergency response studies. The enforcement mechanism, as detailed in departmental guidelines, now incorporates traffic cameras, drone surveillance, mobile radar units, and unmarked patrol vehicles. According to official policy documentation, officers are no longer required to issue warnings for first-time offenses in most violation categories. Additional provisions target specific vehicle types. Electric and hybrid vehicles now face compliance requirements related to pedestrian warning systems, with penalties for disabled or modified alert sounds. Left lane usage on highways is now strictly regulated as passing only, with citations issued regardless of speed. The pedestrian priority framework, as outlined in updated California Vehicle Code interpretations, requires drivers to yield when pedestrians demonstrate clear intent to cross, expanding beyond the previous standard of requiring pedestrians to be actively in the crosswalk. Perhaps most significantly, according to enforcement policy documents released by the California Highway Patrol, the state has officially moved to what it terms a no-warning policy for traffic violations. This represents a fundamental shift from decades of officer discretion that previously allowed verbal warnings for minor infractions. The rollout timeline indicates full enforcement began February 1st, 2026, with no grace period, no public education phase, and no phase-in structure for compliance. That is the official framework, as documented by state agencies and law enforcement bodies. But here is what they are not telling you. This is not a traffic safety initiative. This is a revenue optimization program, dressed in the language of public welfare. And the political implications are far more dangerous than a $1,000 ticket. Consider the operational mechanics here. California, facing a projected budget shortfall exceeding $68 billion, according to Legislative Analyst Office projections, suddenly discovers an urgent need to enforce traffic violations with military precision. The timing is not coincidental. The framing is not accidental. The state has effectively weaponized everyday driving behavior. Rolling stops, a habit literally millions of Californians perform daily without incident, is now legally equivalent to running a red light. Touching your phone at a complete stop, something that causes 0 accidents when the vehicle is stationary, now triggers the same penalty structure as texting while driving at 70 miles per hour. This is asymmetric enforcement design. You create rules so granular, so divorced from actual risk assessment, that compliance becomes nearly impossible without constant vigilance. Then you remove warnings. Then you deploy automated enforcement that eliminates human judgment entirely. The result? A compliance trap. Here is the political calculation they made. Californians will not revolt over traffic tickets. They will grumble, they will pay, they will adjust, but they will not organize politically around it because traffic enforcement feels legitimate. Everyone speeds sometimes. Everyone rolls, stops occasionally. Everyone has touched their phone at a red light. So when you get the ticket, you feel guilty, not angry, guilty. That is brilliant political engineering. But the strategic weakness it creates is catastrophic. Think about what this enforcement regime actually does to state capacity. California Highway Patrol resources, municipal police departments, traffic court systems, all now reallocated towards citation processing rather than actual public safety threats. Officers trained to spot micro distractions, drones monitoring emergency lanes, automated systems analyzing headlight alignment. This is resource misallocation at scale. Meanwhile, what gets deprioritized? Organized retail theft, catalytic converter theft rings, fentanyl distribution networks, carjacking sprees. The state has finite enforcement capacity, and it has chosen to direct that capacity toward drivers going 38 in a 30 zone near a construction site with no workers present. Now zoom out to the public perception dimension. California already ranks near the bottom nationally in quality of life surveys. Cost of living is punishing. Homelessness is visible in every major city. Small businesses are fleeing. Middle-class families are leaving. And now, the state's response is to fine working people $1,000 for rolling a stop sign in their own neighborhood. This creates legitimacy erosion, not immediate, not visible, but corrosive. When enforcement feels predatory rather than protective, when the average driver experiences state power primarily through automated citations and no warning policies, when compliance becomes a financial trap rather than a safety framework, you lose public trust in governance itself. That matters politically because California is not governing from strength right now. It is governing from fiscal desperation. The budget crisis is real. The pension obligations are unsustainable. The infrastructure backlog is growing. The tax base is shrinking as high earners relocate. And the political response is more traffic tickets. Here is the deeper problem. This enforcement model assumes perfect compliance is achievable. It is not. Human drivers make mistakes. Habits form over decades. Muscle memory takes over. You cannot find your way to zero violations. You can only create a permanent citation revenue stream, which means the state has built a fiscal dependency on driver mistakes. That is not governance. That is extraction. And the precedent it sets is toxic. If traffic enforcement becomes revenue optimization, what stops other regulatory frameworks from following the same model? Building codes, business licensing, professional certifications. Every interaction between citizen and state becomes a potential fee generation opportunity. California is not alone in facing budget pressure, but it is pioneering an enforcement-first revenue model that treats its own residents as compliance revenue sources rather than citizens deserving of government that serves their interests. The political blowback will be delayed, but it will be real. Because people notice when the state feels more like a predator than a protector. Now connect this to what is happening beyond California's borders, because internal dysfunction always creates external leverage opportunities. We are in the middle of North American trade renegotiations. The USMCA agreement, which replaced NAFTA, is up for review in 2026. Canada has a new Prime Minister, Mark Carney, who ran explicitly on renegotiating terms more favorable to Canadian interests. Mexico is watching closely. And what is the American negotiating position built on? Economic strength, political stability, state capacity, the perception that the United States governs effectively and can deliver on commitments. California represents 14% of U.S. GDP. It is the fifth largest economy on Earth as a standalone entity. When California exhibits governance dysfunction, when it resorts to predatory enforcement to cover budget shortfalls, when its political class prioritizes revenue extraction over public trust, that sends a signal. The signal is weakness. Mark Carney is not an amateur. He is the former governor of the Bank of England and the Bank of Canada. He understands fiscal stress. He understands when a negotiating counterpart is operating from desperation rather than strength. And what does fiscal desperation do to negotiating leverage? It eliminates it. If California needs traffic ticket revenue to balance its budget, what does that imply about its capacity to absorb trade disruption? What does that imply about its political willingness to hold firm on contentious negotiating points when the alternative is deeper fiscal crisis? Canada knows this. Mexico knows this. China, watching from across the Pacific, absolutely knows this. Here is the geopolitical mechanic. Internal governance failure creates external negotiating vulnerability. When a state government resorts to extractive enforcement, when it treats its own citizens as revenue sources rather than economic participants, when it cannot manage basic fiscal balance without automated citation systems, that state is not projecting strength. It is projecting fragility, and fragility invites pressure. China does not need to invade Taiwan to win strategic concessions. It just needs to wait for the United States to weaken itself from within. Every state that turns predatory toward its own residents, every jurisdiction that prioritizes short-term revenue over long-term legitimacy, every government that loses public trust through extractive enforcement, that is one more structural crack in American cohesion. California is not some isolated policy experiment. It is the largest state economy in the most powerful country on earth. When it exhibits governance dysfunction, when its fiscal model depends on fining working families for rolling stops and touching phones at red lights, that becomes a strategic data point for adversaries. The trade implications are immediate. USMCA renegotiations will involve contentious issues: dairy access, lumber tariffs, automotive rules of origin, digital services taxation, energy exports. Canada will push for concessions. Mexico will push for concessions. And the American negotiating position will be undermined by the visible reality that its largest state economy cannot govern effectively without resorting to predatory traffic enforcement. That is leverage handed to rivals, gift-wrapped in budget desperation. Now consider the precedent this sets domestically. If California can extract revenue through automated enforcement and zero-tolerance policies, other states will follow. New York, Illinois, New Jersey. Every state facing pension crises and infrastructure backlogs will look at California's model and think, we can do that too. Which means the enforcement creep spreads. The public trust erosion spreads. The perception of predatory governance spreads. And international observers, allies and adversaries alike, will note that the United States is increasingly governing through extraction rather than representation. That is not a position of strength. Here is the broader pattern. Empires do not collapse from external conquest. They collapse from internal dysfunction that creates external opportunity. Rome did not fall because barbarians were stronger. It fell because internal decay made defense impossible. The United States is not Rome, but the mechanic is universal. When governance becomes extractive, when legitimacy erodes, when citizens view their own government as adversarial rather than protective, the entire structure weakens. California's traffic enforcement regime is not causing American decline, but it is symptomatic of the kind of governance dysfunction that enables decline, and adversaries are watching. China does not need to win a war. It just needs to wait for American states to find themselves into irrelevance, one traffic ticket at a time. The real cost of California's 2026 traffic laws is not the $1,000 tickets. It is the strategic weakness it reveals. The fiscal desperation, the governance failure, the prioritization of revenue over legitimacy. That is what Mark Carney sees when he prepares for USMCA negotiations. That is what Xi Jinping sees when he calculates leverage in the Pacific. That is what every rival and competitor sees. Internal dysfunction creating external opportunity. So here's the question we should all be asking. When a state as powerful as California resorts to predatory enforcement to balance its budget, what does that tell us about the structural stability of American governance itself? And who benefits most when the answer is not much? Comment below. Does California's enforcement model represent the future of American governance or the beginning of its legitimacy crisis?